Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the costumes in a TV show. Now if I were smart, I would make this video about Bridgerton since that's what's bringing in the views right now. Actually, you know what? I'm going to tell you my opinion on Bridgerton. I'm going to summarize it very, very briefly. This will also be a summary of all of the other videos about the Bridgerton costumes because everybody in this community seems to feel very similarly about the Bridgerton costumes. The costumes in Bridgerton are more historically inspired than they are historically accurate, but that's okay because this is a historical fantasy and not full-on historical whatever. So for those purposes, it's fine, except for this lady who looks ridiculous and like she just stepped out of 1990. There we go. I've summarized all of the Bridgerton videos. I saved you a lot of time. And I feel pretty much exactly the same about the costumes of Bridgerton. They're inaccurate costumes that are inspired by one of my least favorite eras in all of fashion history, so I don't really like them because I don't like their inspiration, but they are good enough. So what this video is actually about is a very old and obscure show that is virtually impossible to find these days, so I know I'm being incredibly clever.
I'm clever.
I'm speaking, of course, of the 1971 BBC miniseries Elizabeth R, starring Glenda Jackson in the titular role of Elizabeth I, and co-starring Vivian Pickles as Mary Queen of Scots. And I think that this may be one of the best made costume pieces in history. It is absolutely amazing. It's 6 episodes long and it follows Queen Elizabeth I from the time when she was imprisoned in the Tower of London up to her death in 1603. The costumes in episodes 1 and 2 are okay. They're not bad, but they're nothing to write home about. However, the costumes in episodes 3 through 6 cannot be topped. They are absolutely incredible. And some of the gowns that they made are actual recreations of actual dresses that Queen Elizabeth wears in some of her state portraits, and even the ones that aren't recreations of state portrait gowns are made using historical tailoring and cutting methods. For example, Janet Arnold says that in the 16th century, bodices tended to be cut in one piece, and all of the shaping would be achieved through the front fastening around here. So there wasn't, they didn't have multiple back pieces or anything. And historical portraiture actually bears this out. It's difficult to find images of ladies' backs. Most people, shockingly, when they're having their portrait painted, don't want to have their back facing the painter. However, this painting of a ball at the court of Henry III of France from 1582 does show several ladies with their backs towards us. We can see that the bodice of the lady seated in the lower left-hand corner is cut in one piece, with a single dart taken at the center back to just nip in the waist a little bit. Although at first glance, the bodices of the two ladies standing with their backs to us appear to be cut in several different pieces, upon further investigation, the placement of these suspicious lines reveals that they are, in fact, just copious decoration and not seams. This method of cutting bodices was made possible by the highly conical and flattened torso shape that was popular in the late 16th century. It would not be possible to cut a more curvy garment, such as a Victorian bodice, in this way. And if we look at the gowns in Elizabeth R, we will see that they're constructed in this exact same way. They're cut from one piece with all of the shaping achieved by the front closures at just a dart at the center back. I would love to do an in-depth analysis of every gown in this series. However, there are a lot of them, and I think doing that would make this video approximately 42 eternities long, and I don't think that anybody would watch that. So I'm just going to talk about the 4 most exciting gowns, starting with this one. This is a copy of the gown worn by Queen Elizabeth in the 1575 Darnley portrait. This one is striking because of the remarkably similar fabrics. I've heard it suggested that the makers of Elizabeth R had this fabric custom made, but I personally think that it was just a very, very lucky find on the part of Elizabeth Waller, the costume designer. If you look very closely, you'll see that the design on the costume fabric is not a perfect match for the design of the fabric that we see in the portrait. So I think that suggests that it was not custom made, because if they were having their fabric custom made, then they would have matched it more closely. A little bonus fact, The colors of this dress look very delicate and pretty, but the portrait is actually very, very faded. And this dress would have originally been much, much more vibrant. The gold curlicues were originally a much more reddish pink color, and not unlike this digitally recolored image you see here, and the striking frog closures at the front were much closer to crimson, rather than this delicate orange color that we see now. Here's a picture of the portrait that has been digitally restored to how it may have looked when it was first painted. Next up is this one. This is a faithful recreation of the gown worn by Queen Elizabeth in the 1575 Phoenix portrait, which is one of a pair of sister portraits, the Phoenix portrait and the Pelican portrait. Interestingly, when I was younger, I thought that the Phoenix portrait was named because Queen Elizabeth's hair looked like flames in the portrait, and I thought that they named the Pelican portrait because Queen Elizabeth resembled a pelican, which she doesn't, but that was where my brain went when I was small. In fact, the portraits are named for the Phoenix and Pelican jewels that she's wearing on her bodice, respectively, in them. The phoenix symbolizes immortality because it never truly dies. When it nears the end of its life, it bursts into flames and is born anew out of its own ashes. It also symbolizes a certain amount of uniqueness, as there is only ever one phoenix in the world at a time. Both of these associations would have been very useful for a monarch to have, so the phoenix became one of Elizabeth's personal emblems. The show faithfully recreated what can be seen of this dress in the portrait, down to the striking embroidery motifs and the decorative slashing. They even seem to have reproduced the brocade forepart, even though it can only just barely be seen in the portrait. When it comes to the skirt and the hem of the dress, we have no idea what they look like. For all we know, it ends 2 inches below the lower edge of the portrait, and Queen Elizabeth is actually rocking a sexy Party City version of herself. Well, okay, we know that that isn't the case, but the point is we don't know what the bottom 2/3 of this dress looked like. That said, I think that the costume designer, Elizabeth Waller, did a very good job of improvising, and if I were to be asked what I thought the bottom of this dress looked like, I would come up with something very similar to this, probably. The most famous images, well, maybe not the most famous, one of the most famous images of Gloriana is the Armada portrait, which is why it was so exciting to see it reproduced here in such amazing detail. There are many different versions of this portrait, which all have minute differences, but the general idea is the same in all of them. Here are 2 of the different versions. The one on the right, which is the more official version, shows alternating blue and pink bows decorating the gown, while the one on the left seems to show pink bows interspersed with bows made out of changeable blue and pink fabric. The embroidery is also different in the 2 different portraits. The sun motifs embroidered on the sleeves and forepart of the left-hand portrait have more rays than the ones on the right-hand portrait. The embroidery on the right-hand portrait also appears to be darker than the embroidery on the left-hand portrait. But that may be because the right-hand portrait was recently restored. In the right-hand portrait, the hanging sleeves are lined with a silver-gray fabric, probably taffeta, whereas in the left-hand portrait they're lined in orange. These differences are probably due to different artists representing things differently rather than actual changes being made to the dress. Many of the articles worn by Queen Elizabeth in the Armada portrait can be seen in other portraits as well. The costume recreation of this dress seems to be an amalgamation of both of these different portraits. It has the embroidery and orange hanging sleeves from the left-hand portrait, and the pink and blue bows from the right-hand portrait. The embroidery that they did for this dress is absolutely astounding. The body of the dress also changes from portrait to portrait, sometimes appearing to be blue and sometimes appearing to be black, although it was most likely made out of velvet. The show did change this slightly by using this black fabric covered with silver speckles, but I can hardly begrudge them this. This fabric shows up elsewhere in the series, and it's not the only fabric that they used in multiple different costumes in the series, so I think what they must have done was to buy several fabrics in bulk to reduce the cost and then just use them where they best could. I can't imagine that the costuming budget for this program was all that huge, so I really can't begrudge them a choice that they made to save cost. Also, and I feel this feels quite sacrilegious, but I kind of like the speckled fabric better than the plain fabric that you can see in the portraits. So I don't mind this one all that much. Last, but certainly not least, is this costume.
If the Armada portrait is one of the most famous images of Queen Elizabeth, then the 1592 Ditchley portrait is definitely the most iconic. Like the Armada portrait, you can see elements of this dress, or this dress in its entirety, appearing over and over again in many different portraits of Queen Elizabeth spanning the 1590s, and also like the Armada portrait, there are subtle variations between all of them. I'm not going to go over all of those variations, however, because this costume doesn't take elements from any different portraits, it's just a copy of the dress that we see in the Ditchley portrait. And what a copy it is. Everything is perfect down to the last little detail. The dress is crisscrossed with this lattice work of what was probably organza or sarcenet or something along those lines, and it's caught down at intervals with these button-like things, and those are called ouches. It's as if you've just touched a hot stove. Ouch! And interestingly, these ouches shown on this dress probably belonged to Henry VIII, as one of his inventories lists a bunch of ouches that sound eerily similar to the ones shown in this portrait. They're arranged on the gown in diagonal lines, and we can see that not only has the costume version mimicked this arrangement, but they've even gotten the precise placement of these different ouches correct. They've also mimicked other details perfectly. Although the linings of the hanging sleeves are decorated with ouches and pearls like the rest of the dress, they lack the crisscross pattern.
I didn't notice this until somebody pointed it out to me, and now I cannot unsee it, and it is so frustrating.
It's unclear whether the actual hanging sleeves on the real dress lacked these crisscrosses or not. Janet Arnold speculates that their omission from the Ditchley portrait was an artistic choice made by the painter because he thought that they made the whole thing look too busy, and she speculates this because most, if not all, of the other depictions of this gown show the hanging sleeves as having the crisscrossed element. However, the costume remained loyal to the portrait, and its hanging sleeves also lack the crisscrosses. Although their omission from the portrait irritates me to no end, their omission from the costume makes me love it even more because of how loyal it is to its source material. They've also managed to recreate the red and gold fabric that makes up the gown, or the part that is not the white, so not the four-part stomacher and hanging sleeve linings. And it can only just barely be seen in the portrait, but they still managed to recreate it, which is incredible. It's interesting to see how the forepart has evolved by the 1590s, going from being a simple little triangle of fabric at the front of the skirt in the early 16th century to taking up a whole half of the skirt by the end. In addition to recreating the dress itself, they also recreated the crown, necklace, and pendant worn by Queen Elizabeth in the Ditchley portrait. In the portrait, the jewels on the crown, necklace, and pendant appear to be red and black, and the movie version holds true to this. However, it is worth noting that although it certainly is possible that these jewels were made out of red and black stones, like ruby and jet, it's also very possible, and actually even more likely, that the black stones are actually diamonds. In the 16th century, portrait painters painted diamonds as black because diamonds don't have a color really, so they just represented them as being black. So it's actually very likely that in this portrait, Queen Elizabeth is wearing rubies, pearls, and diamonds rather than rubies, pearls, and jet or onyx. Once again, though, I can't fault the costume for sticking to the red and black color scheme that we see in the portrait.
I briefly touched on fabric choice when I was discussing the Armada portrait dress, and I want to come back to that because something very, very clever and interesting was done with these costumes where fabric choice is concerned. Now, for the sake of cost, many of these costumes are made out of synthetic fabrics, but they were still able to capture the feel of the fabrics that's hinted at by the textiles portrayed in the portraits. Now, what do I mean by the feel? So I'm going to try to explain that. I would be able to explain it a lot better if I could put in actual clips of these costumes in motion. However, the BBC is incredibly protective of this show, and I, again, don't want to open myself up to any sort of copyright suit, so I'm just going to use still images. Fortunately, I think that the still images are still sufficient to get my point across. So this is what I mean by the general feel of the fabrics.
Well, the Darnley portrait dress looks to be made out of a relatively lightweight silk. To me, it almost looks kind of summery, and it certainly lacks the grand, heavy feeling that's suggested by the gowns worn in some of the other portraits. This lighter, airier feeling is captured by the movie version of this dress perfectly. The Phoenix portrait dress is most likely made out of black velvet embroidered with golden thread or wire, and this would make the fabric very heavy and also moderately stiff. Once again, the costume version of this dress has those exact qualities. The Armada portrait gown appears to be made out of a plain, unembroidered velvet. This would have made it quite heavy, but not as stiff as the Phoenix portrait dress. Again, the costume version of this dress behaves in just the way that one would expect.
As far as the gown shown in the Ditchley portrait, it's really anybody's guess what the back part, the red and gold part, was made out of. You can only see the tiniest little bit of it in the portrait. However, the white, silvery whitey kind of four-part stomacher sleeves and hanging sleeve linings were most likely made out of what's called tinseled satin. Now, there were three types of fabric that I'm aware of, three types of 16th century fabric that included metal elements. These were cloth of gold, cloth of silver, and tinseled satin. Cloth of gold and cloth of silver are made by wrapping gold or silver foil around a silken core and then weaving that into a fabric. Tinseled satin is different. You make that by weaving silk satin and every so often weaving a metal thread into the cloth. So that basically it's just silk satin with wire woven into it. And you can imagine that any fabric that has wire woven into it is going to be very, very stiff. I can only imagine what cutting any of these fabrics did to your shears. And you can see in the portrait that the white portions of the dress do look very stiff, and you can also see this in the television costumes as well. This white dress, the white portions of this dress are incredibly stiff and it barely moves at all.
In this image, Queen Elizabeth is dancing a very active dance. I think it's a galliard, and her dress only moves when she kicks it.
This has just been the briefest of overviews of the spectacular costumes in this show. And I could record an 8-hour video of me just swooning over these gorgeous costumes, but like I said before, I don't think anybody would watch that. But I highly urge you to investigate this further for yourself. Don't take my word for it. I highly recommend that you go and see this series for yourself. Now, that is slightly difficult to do. As far as I know, the only two ways that you can actually see it are by buying the DVDs on eBay secondhand, or by getting a BritBox subscription on Amazon. You could just get the subscription, watch the show, and then cancel it before the free trial ends. That's what I recommend doing. But I highly recommend, however you go about doing it, I highly recommend you see this show so you can see how incredible the costumes are. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. And please leave me a comment. Have you seen this show? What do you think of the costumes? A huge thank you to Mary Royal, Kit Kat Stitch, Sandra White, and Tyrrells, I think, for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you have a lot of extra money lying around and you also want to support the channel on Patreon, then there's a link in the description. In addition, there's a link to my Instagram, so you can follow me there too, if you want to. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.